Blood in the Water. Written by Shiroi Nokuba. Read for you by Gemini Wishes. Summary. When a merpiranha is taken from his home in the Amazon River, biologist and aquarium caretaker Bakugo Katsuki is charged with the rare creature's care. Knowing that hybrid lifespan is dramatically endangered when living in captivity, Katsuki will do anything to ensure that Kirishima has a chance. But he's never cared for such an exquisite and compelling creature, and he may find himself with a surprising new friend. This fic is rated mature, but no archive warnings apply. The sun shone down violently already, so early in the morning. The drafty, high ceilings of the aquarium were a relief in comparison. Katsuki strode confidently across the ugly carpeted floors of the welcome lobby, iced black coffee in hand. The smell of fish, of seawater, of anticipation for another day doing what he'd always dreamed greeted him. But today there was a different smell under all these other familiar ones. The smell of murk and mud, of exotic aquatic life stood out as he paced through the freshwater exhibit, his home for the past few years. A massive tank had been installed in the middle of the room, shrinking the space down to half its original size. It had been under construction since before Katsuki had graduated and started work at the aquarium as an aquatic biologist and caretaker, and it looked to be in its final stages at last.
Where'd they get the money to finish this?
He questioned ironically to the back of his workmate and friend, Mina. She turned to him, a cloud of pink hair giving way to a round, bright and sunny face. Rare new specimen coming in today, I hear. Mina took Katsuki's coffee from his hand and helped herself to a gulp. Money from the board has been sitting unused for a while, apparently. So they took it and scrambled to complete the tank in time. They had 3 weeks to get the habitat complete. Hanta's about to lay an egg. Katsuki took his coffee back as the other biologist snickered at her own joke.
When's arrival time?
I heard noon, but some are saying different. You know, the usual oh-so-very organized admin catastrophe. We'll know when the truck comes. Katsuki huffed, taking a long sip of bitter coffee. It cooled his rising temper. New arrivals were always a nightmare for caretakers on staff. 1 minute it was feeding the seals and penguins as usual, then suddenly the gears had to shift without warning to accommodate an entirely different species into its new habitat. Admin was always critically understaffed, and coupled with the incompetence of the transfer team, it made for calamity every time. In the locker room, he noticed his schedule had been crossed out with marker and redone by hand. Amazon RV exhibit was scrawled across the whole week. Katsuki sighed, massaging his temples. He knew the culprit. In his wetsuit and with other assorted diving paraphernalia in hand, he marched to the new tank exhibit. It looked more like a hive than a river exhibit, bustling with aquarium staff and construction managers and so many others that Katsuki couldn't bother to identify. He saw his target amongst the horde and went straight for him, gripping the back of his shirt in a quivering hand.
Cyril, I swear to God,
he growled, yanking the ponds and lakes expert around to face him. As if prepared for the onslaught, Hanta pasted on his best, innocent, wide-toothed grin and presented him with 2 restaurant coupons to the place that made his favorite spicy pork udon before Katsuki could say anything more.
Please, Bakugo, I need your help with this man.
Hanta held the 2 tickets with both hands in front of his face like a talisman, warding off Katsuki's throttling.
You're the only one with the expertise for this, and the only one I trust. I know it's last minute. Please?
Katsuki considered him for a moment. It really would have helped to commit even a little violence against him to dispense with some of the frustration. But he found he couldn't, not with the prospect of free spicy udon in his future. He snatched the coupons away with a leer.
Fine. You owe me. What's coming in?
Hanta sighed deeply and scratched the back of his neck.
I read the incoming report to admin, and it sounds like a handful. More than a handful, actually. Rare hybrid red-bellied piranha from the Amazon River. Hybrid? You mean the species is part human?
Katsuki asked in disbelief. Hanta nodded solemnly as they stood back to watch the chaos around them.
People in Amazonas, Brazil were complaining of an unknown terror in their rivers, big enough to snatch up anything that came too close to the riverbed. They were afraid it'd start getting curious children. It was eviscerating surrounding fish populations, so local fishermen petitioned the government for it to be relocated. And of all places, the opulent Tokyo sea life was selected.
Hanta smiled ironically as he swung his arms out to indicate their surroundings. Katsuki felt a nervous sweat at his brow.
Zero, we're not equipped to handle a hybrid species. That's why I called you, Bakugo. If anyone can manage the impossible, it's you.
Katsuki shook his head to himself, weighing his non-existent options. He'd only been witness to a mer hybrid one time, back during his field study days in college. He was abroad, living for a semester in the infernal heat and humidity of the Brazilian state of Tocantins, gathering research on the world's largest river and its myriad life forms. On one particularly hot and miserable expedition, fighting the current and biting gnats and trying to conserve the last of his clean water lest he'd die of heat stroke, he'd seen something unforgettable. Pink with mottles of silver had cut through the water near the surface so quickly his boat nearly capsized. She'd likely been the last of her kind, the upper body of a woman with the tail of a pink Amazon river dolphin. The professor with him nearly lost his mind at the sighting, but Katsuki had maintained his composure to take the only pictures in existence of such a specimen. He'd won awards for them. Scientists and biologists and merpeople fanatics of every ilk had shaken his hand, had thanked him for the remarkable photographs, for the contribution to science and aquatic life, and for insight into the rarely seen world of merpeople. And yet, the whole thing felt like it was a dream he'd had. Merpeople were such a rare sighting, growing more and more rare as humans infringed on their delicate habitats. But now one was coming here, to be under his charge. He was nearly dizzy with the thought.
Sero, don't say no, Hanta interrupted. His voice was quiet. Brazil's government committed an atrocious offense against every wildlife preservation imaginable getting this thing out of there. Mer hybrids have astonishingly low survival rates in captivity. You know that. They basically sent it here to die. You're its only hope.
The words died on Katsuki's tongue. He wet his lips, his eyes darting around the busy exhibit, but seeing none of it. He felt a swell in his chest, and he sighed.
Okay. Okay?
Hanta's face lit up with relief.
It's what I said, isn't it?
Katsuki returned with a scowl to counter Hanta's excitement.
But you're handling all of this?
He gestured to the mess around them with one hand.
Until the specimen comes in. Don't even look in my direction until then.
You got it, Hanta nodded. And, about the coupons. You saw theirs too, right? Katsuki turned to walk away.
Yeah, I saw.
I like spicy udon.
You heard me, right? Not a moment before the specimen arrives.
Lunch was more delicious in that it was free. He'd thought of holding on to the second coupon for when the urge for spicy udon next hit, but at the last moment a crop of messy green curls had caught his attention.
This is very delicious,
Izuku said, crouched over his steaming bowl of miso ramen. He chewed politely with one hand over his mouth.
I can see why everyone likes this place so much.
Katsuki took a sip of his drink to get a break from the medley of spice in his meal. They'd been particularly heavy-handed with them in the kitchen, he'd noticed.
Thanks for inviting me, Kachan. I hear coupons for this place are really hard to come by.
Don't mention it, nerd,
Katsuki replied.
I know you guys in admin are just as swamped as we are. Plus you looked so miserable. Not inviting your ass was like leaving an abandoned puppy out in the rain.
Izuku giggled, his freckled cheeks flushed.
Yeah, new specimens are a surefire way to turn this place on its head. I hope I can hang on through finals.
As he spoke, the biology major seemed to deflate as he thought of his impending Hell Week. Katsuki smiled as he watched the younger boy across the table.
You'll be fine,
he said with a slurp of noodles. How about you? I heard they're charging you with his care. Izuku pushed glasses up the bridge of his nose. Katsuki returned to his bowl instead of answering. That bad? He sighed. He knew he couldn't keep anything from his oldest friend. He leaned back in his seat.
It's completely different from all other aquatic species. I mean, he's part human, for God's sake. He's going to live across the world from his natural habitat. Does he understand that?
Izuku was still for a moment, listening. Katsuki caught himself rambling on.
Does he have a name or a place he'd like to sleep? Is he afraid, angry? Will he try to escape?
Katsuki stopped, putting his head in one hand with a deep sigh. They stayed quiet for a while, Izuku slurping the last of his noodles.
I can't answer any of those questions,
he said in a hushed voice once he'd finished chewing.
I'm still only a student. What I can say, though, is that he'll be in the most capable hands he could be in. I'm certain of it. You know where he comes from. You're in his land. You studied his home. Who better than you to bring that home back to him, even if only in part?
Katsuki felt another surge rise inside him.
Yeah,
he said quietly.
Maybe you're right.
Hey, Kachan?
I'm not paying for another bowl. You get the one free. The rest is on you.
Izuku laughed again.
No, that's not it. I was wondering if you'd let me have access to your notes on the specimen?
His smile was wide and beseeching, and he even clasped his hands together.
Please? I think it'll make a great topic for my senior seminar next year. I mean, how many people can say they've closely studied merpeople?
Katsuki smiled.
Sure, fine. But if you forget to credit me, I'm calling into your school for plagiarism.
They laughed together and finished their meals. Back in the aquarium, Katsuki could almost forget the weight of his oncoming task. Save the never-ending bustle that the building had taken on that day, when he was across campus, knee-deep in pond water throwing feed to the sturgeon and lurking catfish, it could almost be a normal day. It occurred to him that maybe Hanta had forgotten to come and find him for the arrival. He checked his watch. It was past closing. Had the bonehead really not kept track of the drop-off? Making his way back to the Amazon exhibit, he found it in more of a disorder than he'd seen it earlier. There was muddy water and wet plant bits everywhere. Katsuki even saw some puddles were stained with blood. Despite the obvious mess, all heads crowded around the massive tank, faces pressed against the reinforced glass. Mouths filled the air with murmurs of curiosity and wonder, and perhaps concern. Katsuki found the black-haired head he was looking for amongst the others.
Sarah, what the hell? What happened to calling me for the drop?
Sorry, man. Everything caught fire at the same damn time. This thing started thrashing, and when we tried to restrain it, it fought even harder. It cut its tail and blood started gushing. It was ugly. There was hardly time to breathe, much less call you in from across campus. Katsuki felt a cold stone sink into his stomach.
All this blood is from the hybrid?
I told you it got ugly. Hanta shrugged apologetically.
Katsuki, nearly blind with anger, made his way to the diving platform. Hanta chased after him.
Bakugo, what are you doing?
Katsuki didn't stop, sliding his diving mask over his eyes and nose.
I'm doing what you should have done the minute you knew he was hurt. Bakugo, no. You can't. We don't even know how it'll react to divers yet. It's angry and afraid. It'll be okay until it's settled down. You're putting yourself in danger.
Katsuki, snorkel secured between his teeth, took a deep breath and kicked off the platform just as Hanta raised his voice in desperation. Shouts of alarm and warning were engulfed in the sound of rushing, gurgling water. He opened his eyes, but he was blinded by sediment and slurry that had been kicked up by the uproar of pouring the fighting piranha hybrid into his new home. Thick plant life bobbed and stirred with the movement of the water. Katsuki stayed near the surface, air rushing loudly through the snorkel. He peered through the muddy water for any sign of movement. He hadn't given himself time to think before he dove, but now, as he waded in the opaque and hastily made swamp passing as the Amazon River, he found he was a little afraid. Adrenaline dilated his veins. His heart thrummed in his ears. If he released the air from his lungs to sink deeper, he knew he wouldn't last long holding his breath. But the fear made him feel alive. He was patient, swimming slowly to the middle of the tank, his eyes wide and his head swiveling. A flash at the far end of the tank caught his attention, and he started. He waded closer carefully, keeping his movements small. Narrowing his eyes to see better, he noticed that it wasn't the hybrid at all. Cell phone flashlights were shining into the tank, the lights cutting through the water giving the floating sediments a disorienting sparkle and casting long shadows. Katsuki growled to himself in frustration, raising his head out of the water and finding Hanta on the diving platform, scrambling to put on his diving suit.
Zero!
Katsuki wrenched out his snorkel to hiss, his voice carrying icily over the water. The other diver looked up.
Tell them to shut those goddamn flashlights off, now!
Hanta raised his voice to direct the other spectators to shut off their lights. The tank surrounding him stopped sparkling, and his anger went down a notch. A moment later, he became aware of a subtle vibration moving through his body. It was tiny, almost a tickle, but the instant he detected it, it started becoming stronger. It pulsed, ringing into his flesh to bounce off his bones. He knew then that he was being watched from the depths.
Bakugo?
Came Hanta's voice from the diving platform. It shook with apprehension.
Bakugo, don't make any sudden movements.
Wide, black eyes were fixed on the water. Katsuki followed them, and his blood went cold for a moment. There, low near the bottom where the cloud of mud was thickest, something big shimmered, rippled with shadow and flashes of red. Katsuki's bones rattled inside him. He was being hunted.
Bakugo, don't move, I'm coming in.
Hanta began fighting with his wetsuit again.
No, don't. Don't come in. But it's going to strike. I'll be fine, Katsuki returned. Do not get in this water.
His pulse raced as fast as his mind. If he was being pursued with hostility, it would mean one of two things.
Sarah, what did you feed him?
Hanta hesitated.
Feed? Katsuki felt the rage boil again. Are you fucking joking? Why were you hired if you don't even know to feed new specimens at arrival?
He could hear more than just feel the strength of the vibrations now. They began to ripple across the surface of the water. The hybrid was closing in. Katsuki focused his attention back on it for his own sake.
Make yourself useful and get me snails. Go now before this guy decides I'm what he wants to eat.
And with that, Hanta scrambled off the diving platform to find the feed. Katsuki kept his eyes on the shimmering shape below. It circled him slowly, and more vibrations rippled through the water.
You're getting a pretty good look at me, huh?
He thought to himself, ducking under the surface again to allow himself to be observed.
If you're not a coward, come out of that soot so I can get a good look at you, too.
The standoff persisted, Katsuki's skin prickling with alarm and his flesh rumbling with low-frequency pulses, and the hybrid making slow, cautious circles just out of clear sight around him, until he heard a shout of his name at the diving platform. He surfaced again to see Denki, an intern, with a bucket. He slung its contents over the surface of the water, and black-shelled feeder snails came raining from it. Katsuki made to grab a handful, but just as he closed his fist around a few, a sharp crunch of teeth scraping the bones in his wrist and a flash of silver and red occurred in the same instant. In the next, Katsuki found he was being pulled from the surface down into the muddy depths of the tank at an alarming speed. Pain flashed brilliantly through his arm up into his shoulder. His cry gurgled into agony-filled bubbles that wobbled up to the surface. He held what he could of a bony dorsal fin, if only to keep his trapped arm from being ripped out of the socket. Smudges of blood made clouds that mingled with the bubbles. At last, the descent seemed to stop in a distinctly thick crop of river weeds. Only then, the hybrid began to thrash, swinging his head and Katsuki's arm back and forth. Katsuki squeezed his eyes shut. It seemed the hybrid really would take his arm. He lost more air in a muffled, bubbling cry when teeth sank impossibly deeper. He opened his eyes to see the hybrid's ear fins twitching with attention. He turned to face Katsuki with his wrist still between sharp teeth, and Katsuki groaned when the bones ground between them. Those ear fins rippled again. Katsuki saw wide and curious eyes peering past a waving cloud of vibrant red hair.
Yeah, you're hurting me, bastard,
he thought to himself, but the hybrid didn't seem to understand how. Katsuki's lungs began to burn. He needed to get himself free before this creature drowned him. But how? He saw the cut on the hybrid's tail, a long and thin slice that looked like it'd heal on its own. Thankfully, the bleeding had stopped, and the hybrid certainly seemed strong as ever. Now his biggest concern was preventing his own injury from getting any worse. Somehow, he found he was still holding tight to the fistful of snails.
This crazy piranha thinks he's got a mouthful of snails, but he's gonna eat me.
Katsuki grabbed the snails in his other hand, waving them before the hybrid's eyes, then opening his palm to present them once vast, black pupils were blown wide with interest. Teeth began to extract painfully from his flesh.
That's it, you feral bastard. Let me go when you get a nice treat.
And the piranha released him to taste the scent of snails in the water. In the same move, Katsuki thrust the snails into two unexpected webbed hands and pushed himself through the water towards the surface as fast as his experienced limbs would take him. He broke the surface with a massive gasp. His lungs felt like they would burst inside him. His very veins burned with the rush of oxygen. Even when he pulled his mask off his face, he couldn't see clearly from the black and colored spots that crowded his vision.
Bakugo!
It was Hanta's voice. Katsuki swam towards it, hands and feet cutting through the water. He tasted blood in the droplets that fell into his mouth. His heart raced, but it wasn't only from the near drowning. As he pulled himself up with other helping hands onto the diving platform, he kept reciting the encounter over and over again in his head. Now he knew what it had been like for his professor on the boat all those years ago. He was struck with nothing short of awe. He would dream of this encounter for as long as he lived.
Oh my God, you're alive. I can't believe you actually lived,
Hanta said as he and others pulled Katsuki up by the arms.
Jesus, look what it did to you.
But Katsuki was smiling. His hand was practically bitten off, blood streaming between his fingers. But he smiled.
Bakugo,
said a new, stern voice.
As soon as we get you patched up, you are to be placed on medical leave.
Katsuki lost his smile and looked up at the voice's owner. Aizawa, one of the aquarium directors and Katsuki's boss, stood tall above him with a deep frown. Katsuki's own scowl rivaled it.
"Leave!"
he roared in disbelief, getting to his feet. "Why?"
"We will discuss in my office, but in short, we can't allow our staff to throw themselves into tanks with aggressive carnivorous specimens that have no history of tameability or friendliness towards people."
Katsuki was ready with a retort to throw at the director's retreating back, but he felt a hand on his shoulder.
"Don't."
It was Hanta who stopped him.
"You don't even know what to say, and he won't listen anyway. It's better to meet him with a full defense in his office. I'll be there too."
Katsuki snarled but stayed silent. Hanta was right.
"Dude,"
the other continued, his voice high with amazement once again.
"You were under there for like 2 full minutes. What happened? How'd you make it let go?"
Denki, the intern who'd been watching from a short distance with wide, stunned eyes, came scampering up to join.
"I thought you were dead for sure. That thing is more vicious than I thought."
Katsuki, holding his damaged and throbbing wrist, raised his head to look at them both.
"He is not an it or a thing, and I'm not going to hear you call him that again."
Hanta and Denki stared, straightening up a little at the command.
"And another thing, he's not aggressive. But Bakugo, look what he did to your arm. Those punctures look deep."
Katsuki looked back down at his injury. Indeed, the wounds were so deep that most of the blood hardly made it to the surface to spill. But Katsuki was certain.
"He didn't mean to bite me."
"Bakugo." It was Denki that spoke up now.
"He came straight for you. I saw it." "No."
Katsuki shook his head.
"I'm positive. He meant to grab the snails and I got in the way. He tasted blood and dove because he thought it was what he was being fed."
He stared at the tooth marks driven into his flesh. He knew without a doubt what he'd seen in those eyes. The curiosity, the concern when he'd cried out, the slow grasp of the pain he was causing. Katsuki felt the memory of those probing vibrations move through him again. He looked behind him into the water.
"Dude, I think the pain is getting to your head."
Denki laughed, a forced sound meant to lighten the mood. Hanta joined.
"Yeah, let's get you dry so we can keep you off forced medical leave."
It was over before it even started. Even with Hanta beside him, rebuffing Aizawa's accusations with calm and calculated justification of his actions, the director was firm and unwavering. Katsuki was to be placed on 3 weeks of medical leave. If he was caught on aquarium grounds, he was to be escorted off. It would give him a chance to heal, Aizawa insisted, and he could come back rested to allow all his charges to thrive under his care. Steaming bullshit, and Aizawa knew it too. He wanted Katsuki contained and out of his hair. And yet, in the end, there was no defense left to stand against the decision. Medical leave was enforced. Katsuki was sent to the locker rooms to retrieve what he needed before being invited to leave campus. Denki sulked like an old dog when he came up to Katsuki's locker.
"I'm sorry, man. I know you were just trying to help. It's not fair." "It doesn't matter," Katsuki said shortly. "It's what he wanted all along. There's no way we would have changed his mind."
Denki agreed, apologizing again, but an idea took like a flame on a match in Katsuki's mind.
"You're friends with that janitor guy, the weird one. What's his name?"
"Mineta?"
"That's the one. He's got keys to this place, right?"
"I'm not sure, but he might."
"Good. Get them from him."
"What?"
"Keep your voice down. I need you to get those keys. I don't care how."
"Bakugo, are you sure that's a good idea?" Katsuki watched the look on the young intern's face move from uncertainty to concern to apprehension. He sighed.
"You won't lose your position. If you get busted, blame it on me. Tell them it was peer pressure."
"You're already in hot water with Aizawa," Denki started.
"I know, so try not to get busted."
The intern paused, thinking for a moment.
"Okay," he whispered. "I'll do it."
A thrill moved through Katsuki. He nodded once and closed his locker, his belongings in a bag slung over his shoulder. He conceded when security escorted him from the building. It was dark out when he got a text message on his phone. It was from Denki. "Keys are in your mailbox," it read. Katsuki dashed outside and opened the mailbox beside his apartment door. There on top sat a ring of keys and a card pass on a lanyard. Katsuki flipped it. Denki's ID photo smiled back at him behind the lamination. Katsuki felt a tightening in his chest. He took a picture of the items in his hand, typed out his own message, and sent it to Denki. "Ramen's on me for a month."
Getting into the building at night felt like less of a heist than Katsuki had expected. Black hoodie pulled over his blonde hair and Denki's lanyard tucked in his pocket next to the keys to the whole building, Katsuki was anonymous under the night cameras, undoubtedly watching his every move. The first thing he did once inside was disable the eagle eye camera fixed in the ceiling above the Amazon River exhibit. He left the others on. Frankly, he didn't care if he was seen in the building. Aizawa had specified he had to be away during business hours, but it was wiser to minimize evidence. That was the easy part. The hard part, he found, was standing at the edge of the diving platform, looking down into murky water. Little waves of movement lapped at the edges of reinforced glass. Katsuki took a deep breath. His arm ached where he'd been bitten, despite the advanced treatment he'd received, and he held it. His heart beat almost painfully in his chest. Was he scared? A wave larger than the rest swelled and moved towards the platform. A silver form surged beneath it. The hybrid was on the move, and Katsuki realized it wasn't fear that lit fire in his belly. It was excitement that set his palms sweating, his breath moving quick and shallow. A smile ached in his cheeks. He went down on his knees, looking closely at the moving surface of the water. He was caught off guard when he suddenly realized he was looking straight into red and black eyes. Katsuki scrambled back a bit in surprise. The hybrid surfaced, just the top of his head coming over the water, red hair slick as it streamed over his silver-scaled face. They blinked at each other, neither of them moving for a while. Katsuki hummed quietly. Earphones ticked with the sound. He saw 2 silver hands come above the surface, holding something. It was his diving mask. He'd abandoned it in his race to the diving platform. Already it was browning with soot.
You found my mask.
He reached slowly towards the hybrid, opening his palm. 2 timid hands placed the dripping wet mask in his. Before he could pull his hand back, the hybrid rose further out of the water and one of those scaled hands closed around his arm. Katsuki held his breath with alarm, but there was no pain at all, not even from the claws tipping each webbed finger. The hybrid chittered to himself as Katsuki pulled up his sleeve and let him inspect the bandages wound around his arm. He even began undoing the wrap, and Katsuki let him. The chittering turned to a low rumble when the mostly healed wound was revealed.
Yeah,
he whispered, and the hybrid continued to vocalize in quiet curiosity.
It hurt before, but I'm okay now. Those teeth of yours are pretty killer. I know you didn't mean to hurt me, though.
Slippery, scaled fingers slid over the pink scars. Katsuki watched the top of that wet red hand, eyed the slick man's body vigorous with muscle, relished the incredible gentleness of that touch, all with amazement.
Hey, can you...
The hybrid looked up at him at once, his eyes dilating and constricting rapidly under the single light Katsuki had turned on above. He lost his words for a moment under that intense, intelligent gaze.
Can you understand me?
The hybrid's head tilted to one side and he chittered again.
É português que você fala?
He asked hesitantly. Could it be the hybrid understood Portuguese instead? But 2 eyes continued to blink back at him with no response.
Good. I can barely remember any Portuguese anyway. You got a name?
The hybrid opened his mouth and let a growl out that rippled his gills and ear fins alike, though it was not a threat.
Hungry, huh? Here.
He reached behind him into a bucket of fat-shelled clams. He grabbed a few and presented the soggy heap. The hybrid's eyes became circles and his chittering became more hum of excitement. He swiped for the shells, but Katsuki had learned and he was faster. He scolded, smirking to himself when the hybrid looked into empty hands.
Your name first, then clams. You gotta give me a name, right? Here, this is my name.
He picked up his goggles and showed the hybrid the headband where his name was written.
Ba-ku go. Like that. That's me.
He pointed to himself, then to his name, and then to himself again. He said his name slowly and pointed to himself over and over, until the hybrid began to point too. He tried Katsuki's name in a soft, rumbling voice. Katsuki's skin rippled with goosebumps at the low, almost human quality of it.
Yeah.
He breathed in astonishment, smiling. The hybrid smiled too, a mirthful grin that showed rows of lethal teeth. Katsuki pointed to him this time.
Now you.
The hybrid's finger turned questioningly to himself, and Katsuki saw the confusion. He pointed back to himself and said his name, then to the hybrid again. The mist of confusion cleared, and the hybrid reached for the mask. With one claw to the headband, he traced invisible lines on the rubber. With his bizarre and lovely voice, he said, "KiriBaku." He moved away again. Katsuki was stunned to silence. His face hurt from smiling, and he yielded the handful of clams. The hybrid munched on them heartily, his teeth crunching the shells easily. Katsuki watched him for a while. He finished the clams and reached for Katsuki's hand, pulling on it and purring for more. Katsuki scolded him gently. "No more for you." A sad and pleading growl rumbled through Katsuki's body. He shook his head determinedly. He leapt with surprise when he felt teeth close carefully around his forearm, gnawing him.
"Ah, what's the matter with you? No pouting, and no biting. Hey, who's in there?"
Katsuki whipped around to the sound of that stranger's voice. He heard a hissing behind him, and turned to watch as the hybrid, Kirishima, dove back into the water and disappeared under the surface without so much as a splash. Katsuki took the cue and yanked his hood back over his head, taking off towards the closest exit as the shouting continued. He laughed and whooped to himself as he escaped, the thrill of it all leaving him delirious. He lay in his bed and gazed up at the stars for hours, saying it again and again, trying that name over and over. Kirishima, 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 Kirishima. There was no joy greater than the feeling of that in his mouth, never a more enticing taste on his tongue. He slept through most of the next day, waking when the sun was already set. He could hardly keep himself still in anticipation of the aquarium's closing time, and found himself staking out in his closet disguise until the sun was down and all signs of other employees had died to silence. Once inside, he saw that the camera in the exhibit was disabled and let the spring of elation in his step carry him quickly to the diving platform. He disrupted the surface of it with his hand. "Hey, Kirishima." He delighted privately in the thrill he felt saying it out loud. He searched under the dark waters. "Oi, I've got more clams." A red head rose out of the water, and when Kirishima saw who was there, he smiled to his ear fins and let out a chirp of excitement. He sank below again and came closer to the platform, rising again with that same smile. "Makuko," he hummed. Katsuki shivered like he had before, grinning too. "You hungry? Want some clams?" Kirishima nodded enthusiastically when he saw the shells in Katsuki's hand. This time, Katsuki fed him until the bucket was empty. Kirishima rumbled with gratification, and Katsuki chuckled at him. "You're a greedy fucker, aren't you? What, they don't feed you enough?" Kirishima opened his mouth and made a sound like disagreement. He reached out of the water and grabbed Katsuki's hand, holding it tight between gentle webbed fingers. "Makuko," he purred slowly. Katsuki felt an embarrassing heat rise in his face, and the hybrid made a sound like laughter. He rubbed his wet and scaly face on Katsuki's hand, then before Katsuki could react, closed his teeth around a few fingers.
"Ow! Hey, what did I say about biting?"
Kirishima laughed again in that strange and wonderful way, then pulled Katsuki closer to bite again on his upper arm. Katsuki cried out, which made Kirishima ripple with amusement. The piranha released him to escape into the water when Katsuki moved to swipe at him.
"Oh, no you don't."
Katsuki smiled, his every muscle trembling with joy. He stood and wrenched off his sweater and pants, toes curled over the edge of the diving platform. He took in as much air as his lungs would hold and leapt headfirst into the tank. He was defenseless in the water, naked, almost completely blind. Kirishima drifted around him, his sleek body cutting through the water as easily as Katsuki could through the air. He was a dazzling creature to behold, and though his vision was blurry and his eyes stinging with soot, Katsuki marveled at the way his scales caught the light and shimmered with iridescence. He filled Katsuki with vibrations, and he set off after the hybrid, catching him by the tail and letting Kirishima pull him through the water for a bit. The piranha doubled back over himself and caught Katsuki's shoulder with another bite and a wicked smile. Katsuki let a complaint bubble into the water, then reached and tugged a handful of silken red hair. Kirishima complained too, then bit him again, and on they went with their lawless game. It went like this for days. Katsuki would wait until the aquarium closed, then he'd sneak in and leap into the tank to swim until some unfortunate staff person came and sent him dripping wet and running for the exit, or more likely until the sun chased him out and back to his apartment. Then he'd spend the day dreaming of returning, dreaming that he could breathe water instead of air, Kirishima's bites had given him a tail, and they could swim together and race through the never-ending torrent of the Amazon River. His bites ached, and yet he ached for them too, returning every night to offer himself to those gentle, deadly, loving jaws. He'd practically become nocturnal by the time his forced medical leave had ended, but he was still on his feet, bright and early for his first day back to daylight. He skipped coffee, the ache of each tooth mark enough to leave him sufficiently electric already, and went straight to work. Everyone greeted him as he strolled in. "I missed seeing your face around here," Izuku said to him with a bashful blush in his cheeks. Katsuki changed into his wetsuit and found Hanta on the diving platform at Kirishima's tank, carelessly tossing shellfish to the piranha hybrid. Kirishima stayed under the water, waiting for the food to reach him, and even then he would dash by almost too quickly to see and grab the food to eat hidden away in the shadows. Katsuki couldn't stand to watch it for more than a moment.
"Oi, soy sauce!"
He stomped on his way up to the platform.
"What do you think you're doing?"
Hanta looked around, like he didn't know the answer that Katsuki wanted to hear.
"I'm feeding him. Like that?"
"Yes?"
"Wait, first you complain that I don't feed him. Now you're complaining about how I feed him?"
Katsuki rolled his eyes, snatching the bucket away. He kneeled at the edge of the platform and put his hand in the water.
"Kirishima, it's me. Get up here, shitty scales."
"What did you call him? Kirishima?" Hanta asked hesitantly behind him.
"Yeah, that's his name."
"He has a name?"
"Of course he has a name, dumbass," Katsuki growled over his shoulder.
"And how did you figure it out?"
"He told me, obviously."
"He told you?" It didn't sound like a question.
"Zero, stand over there and stop asking such dull questions, would you?"
"Okay," Hanta shrugged. "At least I'm not the one making friends with the captive merpiranha." Katsuki sucked his teeth, but not because of Hanta's flimsy comeback. Kirishima wasn't coming to the surface like he always did when Katsuki called to him. He grabbed a handful of shells and put his hand back in the water, waving it and calling for the hybrid. But still nothing happened. A strange and hollow feeling caved in his chest. Why wouldn't he come? An unfamiliar anger boiled over, and Katsuki smashed the shell in his hand on the platform. "Whoa, man, what the hell?" Hanta exclaimed, but Katsuki ignored him. He took the largest shard of shell in the heap and leapt into the water.
"I know what you want, you shitty piranha,"
he thought to himself as he sank lower and lower. He held out his hand, and before he could think, he brought the sharp end of the shell across his palm. His nose scrunched at the pain, but he let his blood cloud into the water. Vibrations began to move through him, and he smiled.
"Yeah, that's what I fucking thought. Come on out, you crazy bastard."
Kirishima appeared, filling Katsuki with a probing purr. He approached slowly, his magnificent body reflecting every color, and his mouth open to taste Katsuki's blood as it floated through the water, his eyes dilating to a deep, dark black. When he was close enough, Kirishima grabbed his hand and brought it to his mouth, running a warm, soft tongue along the length of the cut Katsuki'd made. Katsuki felt an intimate tremor move down his spine. "Bakugo," the hybrid said, as clearly under the water as he did above. Katsuki smirked as Kirishima rubbed his silver and red face into his palm and purred. Katsuki wound his fingers in supple red strands, genuine and tender at first, then gave it a playful tug. Kirishima's gills quivered and he exclaimed with surprised excitement, the red of his eyes consuming the black until they were slits. He leaned forward, one hand tilting Katsuki's chin away from where he ducked his face in close. Katsuki stilled when he felt the graze of teeth against the vulnerable flesh of his neck, and groaned when that graze became a bite. There was only enough force behind it to make Katsuki's blood run faster, and he leaned away, almost smiling. The two of them swam together to the surface, Kirishima making a show of twining around Katsuki's body as they rose, brushing that tender red belly against him and weaving their limbs together in a playful dance. The hybrid propelled himself toward the diving platform, where he met Hanta's look of absolute astonishment.
"Close your mouth, Sero. You'll attract more flies than that bucket of clams."
Katsuki, not even trying to hide his smug smirk, hoisted himself onto the platform.
What? How? I told you to stop the dull questions, right?
Katsuki nudged him, and he finally took a breath.
I have your intern to thank. You'll write him in to be salaried, or it'll be me you answer to.
Hanta blinked for the first time since Katsuki had come onto the platform, eyeing him up and down. If he saw the bite marks peeking from under the wetsuit, he said nothing. Hand-feeding Kirishima, throwing clams into the air to prompt the piranha to leap out of the water to catch them, especially, began to attract some of the aquarium visitors. After about a third of the feed was gone and in Kirishima's belly, Katsuki stood and clapped Hanta on the shoulder.
"I take it you can handle it from here?" Katsuki asked ironically,
then stepped down from the platform. He went back to the locker room and showered, throwing on an old tank top. He smiled at himself in the mirror as he toweled his hair, admiring his collection of tooth marks. Some were deeper than others. Kirishima often forgot his own strength when playing, but they all healed with a nice pink pucker of a scar. Running his hands over them gave him goosebumps. Izuku commented on them when he returned to the exhibit.
"Those are some gnarly bites, Katchan,"
he said, a morbid kind of interest misting his eyes.
"Those are from the hybrid?"
Katsuki cut a sideways glance at the younger admin worker. He smiled privately and pushed up his glasses.
"I saw you on the cameras. Don't worry. As far as anyone knows, there was a convenient malfunction on every vital view during your visits."
Katsuki smiled.
"You feel like ramen today?"
"Yo, Bakugo!"
Hanta called from the platform.
"He's not jumping anymore."
Katsuki sighed.
"Well, of course not. He's a mer-piranha, not a dolphin. Seriously, you ought to lose your job sometimes."
Standing in front of the massive tank, Katsuki used the side of his fist to bang on the glass. It was an easier sound on Kirishima's sensitive ears than the sharp rap of knuckles, and right away Katsuki saw some of the plants in the back of the tank begin to move.
"Come on, Kirishima. Look at everyone who came to see your ass."
Kirishima peeked out from the plants. He caught a glimpse of Katsuki and came rushing out at once. He only stopped because of the glass, and still he hit it with all the strength of his momentum. The crowd gasped at the massive sound. Most of them jumped with surprise, and Katsuki laughed.
"Don't worry,"
he appeased them with a smirk, crossing his arms over his chest and making no effort to conceal the marks riddling his skin.
"He doesn't bite."
The end.